Welcome, everyone, to the Menttium Matters podcast, where we talk about leadership, life, and the transformative power of mentoring. I'm Megan Cummings-Krueger, and today we're going to be talking with Marisa Williams, the Chief Executive Officer and dynamic leader of the Girl Scouts River Valleys. With her rich experience working with communities and success in leading cultural change within organizations, I am excited for this opportunity to be able to share her perspective and her wise insights. Now, before we begin our conversation, let me first share with you a little of Marisa's background, just how she gained all of this experience and perhaps at times hard-won wisdom. When you first meet Marisa, it is immediately clear she is a passionate and purpose-driven leader. A self-described non-traditional Girl Scout, it would be fair to say that Marisa is also, in many ways, a non-traditional leader, disruptor in the best sense of the word. She approaches organizations with an open eye, focused on broadening their ability to achieve their mission. She embraces failure as an essential part of growth and finds success by pursuing unconventional paths. Before joining the Girl Scouts River Valleys, Marisa served as the Chief Executive Officer of Hearth Pittsburgh, an organization dedicated to transitional housing, and held multiple leadership roles in the financial services sector. She served on the executive committee for the Governor's Commission for African American Affairs in Pennsylvania and the Pittsburgh Downtown Partnership, adding to her impressive resume of community involvement. Marisa holds a bachelor's degree from the University of Pittsburgh and an executive leadership certificate from Carnegie Mellon University. Her leadership philosophy is deeply rooted in investing in people and building an inclusive environment that celebrates diversity. She envisions Girl Scouts as key contributors to workforce development, college and career readiness, and leadership development in Minnesota. Originally from Media, Pennsylvania, she now resides in Minnesota with her husband, Eugene, and their son, Eugene D. Williams IV. Marisa is also a proud member of the Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated and Jack and Jill of America Incorporated. So with all of that being said, welcome, Marisa.
Thank you.
So, as I just went over with your bio, so far in your career, you have dedicated the majority of it working with community organizations focused on leading that change that is needed to, enhance their cultures and significantly expand their reach. You've credited much of your success to intentionally embracing authentic leadership. So would you share what that means to you?
Sure. So again, thank you for having me on today. I love talking about just authentic leadership and how you can bring all of who you are to what you do. And that's the gift that you give to other people. So when I think about this, I had to reflect on what was my first board opportunity. And so I started serving on boards when I was 22 years old, working on the west side of Chicago, not the West Loop, the west side. That is a very different geography. And so when I think about that, I started organizing when I was 11, when I called out my middle school for not acknowledging Black History Month in the appropriate way, and called in our counselors and teachers and my friends and said, let's organize and figure out how we make this happen. And it turned into a 20 plus year celebration that they did years after we started that original one. So when I think about disruption, I always think about it being for good and making sure that you leave places better than you found them. And so when I think about my experience at Girl Scouts River Valleys, Girl Scouts is an institution. Everyone knows what this organization is. They don't always know why it was started, right? And they don't always understand the founder. They don't know necessarily who the founder was, Juliette Gordon Low, and that she was a disruptor in her own right. Because in 1912, who was teaching women how to survive off of land? Who was teaching women, about courage, confidence, and character? Women didn't have rights back then. Women couldn't initiate their own divorce. They couldn't have bank accounts, right? And so when you fast forward to 2025, how much different are we now, right? And how much do we water down the importance of building girls of courage, confidence, and character by reducing them to just Thin Mints? This is an organization that was about advocacy and
Mm,
ensuring that young girls knew that their voices mattered. And there is not a time better than right now to ensure that our young girls are fortified with that information and know that everything that they need to be exactly who they are is already planted inside them. They just need to water that garden.
absolutely. Absolutely. And it really does come down. I love how you just very simply distilled down to the mission, to the purpose of what it was all about. I also love that, what were you, 11 or 12 when you first started your first disruption? Very successfully, I might add, which tells me that, part of this obviously is just how you were wired. I
Mhm.
suspect maybe we'll give a little credit to parents.
Definitely have to give credit to my mom who weathered all of that, because having passionate children also means you need to have a patient parent in the process. And
Yeah.
so, you can't, you have fire starters and then you have folks that will literally cancel your flame. And so I'm grateful that my mom was not one that decided, hey, we need to put this out because you're a little too fast, right? Because it's paying off dividends now.
Absolutely. As someone who also had a daughter who very much, had the fire, and I may have shared this with you before, but I heard this quote early on, and I'm so grateful for it, which was, you can't put the fire in the girl, but you can take the fire out of the girl. What I
Yes.
love is it's really coming full circle, with you and the work you're doing with Girl Scouts. Again, as we're saying, leadership roles that you've taken on, you're disrupting the status quo. You're broadening the organization's perspective, as well as, of course, the impact. So, just by that nature, you've gained a lot of experience over the years managing through change. This is not always an area of strength for many of us. Many of us have trouble managing through change. And then some of us, like you, start out wired that way and then hone that strength. So, would you share with everybody, how you've honed that ability to manage people and organizations through change and what you've learned from your experience?
For sure. I mean, listening to you say it's clear that you've been wired that way, what resonates most is, that's a gift, right? And I say it tongue in cheek, but truly I believe that God gave me these skills and has placed me in these environments to be able to spark change in a different way. And so the ability to be able to walk into a space and see it with fresh eyes and be able to identify, okay, so if we want to succeed or we want to excel or we want to shift, what are the things that need to happen and what's the order in which they need to happen, and who are the people that I need to make sure I'm surrounding myself with to make it happen? Because it would be a complete and utter lie for me to say that I do this work by myself in a vacuum. It's not possible, right? You have to get folks that are in alignment with you and understand where you're trying to go, and that won't be detractors from your work, but will hold you accountable to and point out the issues that you might not see, right? And so it's not always successful. Like, there are definitely going to be opportunities, and there were a lot of moments where it's like, okay, you got to fail fast and figure it out and move forward. But I think that's also a skill, like not being afraid to fail opens you up to so many different possibilities that, had you not tried or gone in that wrong direction, you wouldn't have ended up where you're supposed to be. So embracing the fear of failure and knowing that it's going to be okay, right? That has been truly helpful to me. And so when I think about just my journey, even with the YMCA, when I left corporate and started running several Ys, I was like, oh my gosh, what am I doing? I love being in the nonprofit space, but I was like, I'm going to run a gym and swim, but they say that it's more than that. And I'm searching for what the more is because I hadn't experienced the Y before. Right. And so I'm looking at this downtown facility that serves all of these corporate adults, but I have a school that uses my facility as a gym class. So who would have thought bringing ninth graders and corporate leaders together and saying, okay, Well, there's opportunity to expose you to each other in a positive way because, ninth grade is challenging. You have CEOs of these powerful organizations and you have ninth grade girls and boys. And I'm like, do you know that this person runs this organization? And in ninth grade, you're just excited about how much money people make, right? And so you're like, and this is what they make in a year. And you're like, wait a minute, Miss Marisa, we need to have more conversations about that. I said, yes, we do. Absolutely. And so connecting those dots for our kids, because I truly believe children can't aspire to be what they can't see, but them understanding, I see them on the gym floor every week and I'm in the gym. So we should probably have conversation. And that's where the Y Achievers program started, right? So taking something that I thought, okay, how am I going to turn this into an opportunity to build community and give the community something to invest in? And investing in young people is the best thing that we can do.
I just love that example. And, with my mentor mentality, I think about how, mentors are the first to say they feel they learned as much as their mentee. And while many would say these corporate executive types, are the mentors to these young kids, I suspect they felt they took a lot of learning. And I would say also, it is very challenging for many of us to approach failure the way you do. And yet it is so pivotal. Whenever, reading about leaders and we're hearing about their path, that willingness, that courage to fail quickly is such a mind shift. And so building on that courage piece, part of broadening people's perspective really does come down to having the courage to speak up, speak truth, even when and often will be a bit uncomfortable. You shared a Brene Brown quote with me earlier. I just loved that clarity is kindness. Is there a story that comes to mind for you of a good example of what a difference your view on that has made?
Moving to Minnesota from the East Coast, I've had a lot of time to learn about not just Minnesota nice, but what it means to adapt your leadership style in cultural shifts. And I think a lot of folks probably would say, okay, well, you've lived in Pittsburgh, you've lived in Chicago, you lived in the Midwest before. I have absolutely not. I have not experienced anything like the culture in Minnesota. And I will say it has helped me in my leadership journey by being able to really boil down what I need to be successful and what I need others to hear me say, probably repeatedly, what I need from them in order for us to work collaboratively well together. And so I think within my first year of coming to Minnesota and working with Girl Scouts, I had several team leaders that I would find myself asking myself, because you talk to yourself in leadership all the time, it's lonely, but you're like, didn't I say that? And didn't I write that? This is the email where I said the things. And so I learned very quickly working with my senior leadership team, okay, clarity is kindness and being direct is not a bad thing. That's probably like the worst thing I could probably say in Minnesota, but being direct is not a bad thing. And so as I learned, hey, you're probably going to need to say this several times and you're going to have to ask people, help me understand what about XYZ directive was either unclear or wasn't thoroughly explained enough, right? And so when I began to ask those questions, it was like you're de-arming people and there's no more defense. It's not a bad thing. I'm just asking, what about this expectation was unclear so that we could come to an understanding and move beyond it? Because I think when you don't provide clarity, there's so much room for defenses to heighten and for misunderstandings to take place and probably last a lot longer than they need to, when you probably just need to have a conversation, move on, and you're good to go. right? And so being able to express what's necessary quickly. My husband and I call it what's the rebound rate, right? I mean, we're about to celebrate 10 years and we're like, our rebound rate is good. Like we can have a disagreement and keep it moving. And I'm like, I need to be able to do that at work and teach my folks, like, how do we have a really good rebound rate? Like, okay, that was a misunderstanding. Boom, we're back in the game and we're moving and shaking. And so I think that's really important. I think one of the things you said, Megan, before about courage isn't about moving forward and ignoring the fact that fear exists. It's about moving forward in spite of it, right? And I think that over the course of my life, it's shown very true that there are certain times where it's extremely dangerous to stay quiet. I don't think I've ever met a debate that I didn't answer to. But when I think about this idea of being a disruptor, I like my coffee hot or I like it iced. I never like it lukewarm. And so I do my very best to ensure that when I show up, people know exactly what they're getting from me all the time because consistency is key. And it might appear, oh, she's not afraid of speaking truth to power. She never really, backs down from a challenge or a debate. No, I spend a lot of time praying about what should come out of my mouth because I recognize that in this space in my journey, my words carry more weight than sometimes I want them to. And I have to be really clear and I have to be really careful about what I release.
Yeah, absolutely. It sounds like, overall, you weren't taking it personally. You were taking that step back. And one of my favorite mantras is be curious, not furious. And you were like, what didn't they hear? And how can
Mhm.
I adjust that? And I do find it's very easy to take things personally, particularly when it comes to communication. But it sounds like your clarity of your purpose and the difference you want to make is kind of a North Star.
It absolutely is. And so when I think about my passion and purpose intersecting in 2014, when I started working in nonprofit, it was like all of the things that I cared about were magically coming together. And so I was like, oh, okay, this is going to be awesome, right? And so I had this foundation of banking and the understanding of what it means to work in corporate America, but I was able to then translate that and work in nonprofit and help to develop some nonprofit leaders along the way with some corporate principles while also focusing on how do I amplify marginalized communities and voices and how do I make sure that I leave people feeling less broken than when I met them, right? And so if you can put all of those things together and then you fast forward to Girl Scouts reaching out in 2022. And I'm like, what? Minnesota Girl Scouts? But then when I think about it, it's like you have been prepared for such a time as this, right? It's like girls need you. They need the unapologetic leadership of someone who's like, you know what? We're going to say the things, we're going to do the things, and we are going to be unapologetic about it because we have to. And the sense of urgency is now. And if we don't do what we need to do for girls, we are going to lose because technology is out there, social media is out there. There's so many competing voices. And if we don't show up the same way that those loud voices do, then in essence, we're saying we don't care the same amount. And so I can't show up timid. I have to show up courageous. I have
Yeah.
to show up confident. And I have to make sure that it's coming from the right place. It's not about how do we put Marisa out front, it's how do we center our girls and the impacts that they are living day in and day out and make sure that the product of Girl Scouts is no longer the cookies that they sell, but it's the product of Girl Scouts is the future of our girls themselves.
In your bio at the beginning, I was sharing how you see, your goals for Girl Scouts. And it's inspiring. It's also much broader perspective. And you shared a little bit about, some of your goals and ideas moving forward. And I'd love to have you share just a little bit around that.
Sure. And I think a lot of folks have heard me say, we're not just cookies, camps, and crafts, right? And, some folks who have been legacy Girl Scouts because their grandmother and their mother, and they're all Girl Scouts, and that's a wonderful thing. But I think even they know it's so much more than just that. It's what are we teaching our young people about themselves, and how are we teaching them to show up in a world that sometimes and more often than not is going to question, who are you? Why are you here? And what makes you feel entitled to be in this space? And so teaching our girls, I think I love when you said, be curious, not furious, right? How do we ask more questions? Right? And that's one of my words for 2025, curiosity. It's like, how am I asking more questions? How am I positioning myself, not necessarily to be the authority on a thing, but how do I ask more questions to learn more information so that I can show up in the best possible way for the audience that I'm talking to, whether it be our daisies or it be our corporate partners or our legislators, right? Because you got to do all of those things. And so when I think about our goals, one, it's reaching girls and families who never thought the Girl Scouts was something that their children would benefit from, right? And when you think about that, we are serving nationally 1.8 million girls, which sounds like a lot, but there's over 30 million girls in this country. So what are we doing? What are we not doing? Who are we not talking to? What things are we not showing communities that make them say, oh, I definitely need to be a part of this, right? And so trying to do that within our council of 46 counties across the Twin Cities in southern Minnesota, I'm having fun doing it, but it's a lot of work, right? And so you have to have these conversations about who we are, what we do, and why we want to do what we want to do. And so when you talk about career and college readiness, workforce development, and leadership development, it's taking those buzzwords of courage, confidence, and character and putting action items underneath them, right? It can't just be about a buzzword. What are we doing, and how are we making sure that we are prioritizing what girls need and asking them, what is it that you think you need? Because we can come in as the adults and say, hey, this is what you need based off of reading The Anxious Generation, which if you're not reading that and you're working with youth, you need to jump in and do that right now. But it's asking our girls, hey, we're feeling and seeing this. What is it that you need so that you feel supported, so that you can do what you were put on this earth to do? Because we want to make sure that we're a part of that story.
Absolutely. I mean, I get excited just listening to this. So I want to shift now because there's one other topic that we talked about earlier. There is our work, our professional work, and then there is our overall, the classic work-life balancing act. Love how you visualize this. You told me that you capture it as balancing my glass balls. So would you share with everyone how you see this?
Sure. So when you think about the illusion and the myth of work-life balance, one, I don't think there's ever been an interview where anyone has ever asked a man how they balance work and life, right? One day we'll get to that space. It's not anytime soon. But when I think about how I started to look at my ecosystem after shortly becoming a mom, it was like I started my nonprofit career, I got married, I had a son. All of these things happened very quickly. And it was through that season of my life that I started to see all these little red capes all around the city of Pittsburgh. I was like, why didn't you tell me you all were superheroes? How are you a working mom and you still like your head is on your neck and it's connected? Like, how are you doing this every day? And so starting out very early in my new mom space, I started to carve out boundaries, right? Okay, this is what I'm calling Eugene time. So if the Y is on fire between 6 p.m. and 9 p.m., call the fire department because I can't help you, right? But this is Eugene time. I will never get this time back in my son's life. I don't need to have access to my phone. Life will happen. It will be fine. And I can tell you, we never had a fire. We were fine, right? But starting to carve out small boundaries And that was particularly for my son. As I continued to grow in my career journey, I was like, oh, I can't just carve out things for my son. There's this other guy over here that I kind of need to spend time with. So then it was like, okay, so how are you carving out time for Eugene the fourth? How are you carving out time for Eugene the third? And then when I moved to Minnesota and I realized, oh, I'm not on my list, right? Because in all the things that we do, I liken it to the responsibilities that we have are like balls that are in the air. Out of all of the things that I juggle, all of those balls are rubber. My glass balls are my son, my husband, and now myself. So everything else in my world will bounce. And there are times where I will pick up work and that will be great. I still have to keep these three balls in the air, right? So how am I juggling all of the things? Sometimes things are just repeatedly bouncing until it's my time to pick that thing back up, right? And we have to make sure that we create space for other people to see we're not superheroes. We're human. And sometimes a ball is going to drop. You just need to make sure that you're prioritizing the balls that cannot. And when that happens, you realize things start to flow a lot easier because in this society, we glorify busy and we really need to stop doing that. And so, one of those things that I'm trying to make sure that I'm passing along, not just to my team, but also to our teenage girls, you don't need to glorify busy. You don't need to be booked and busy every single day, right? There is time for rest. There is time for relaxation. There's time for Netflix. It's okay. You're going to be all right. But we need to make sure that we prioritize rest. And one of the things I heard this several years ago, rest is a requirement. It's not a reward for great work.
Yes. Yeah, I love that. And I love that visualization. And I think part of what I loved about that story is your recognition that you needed to be a glass ball. You needed
Yes.
one of them.
It
Because,
came a little later than I'd like, but we're here.
what I would say is that is commonly, often what women tend to do. We're last on the list or we're not even on the list. So I appreciate that. All right. Well, I've got two last questions. I could listen to you all day. And every time I talk with you, I just get energized because I love your vision. People listening to this podcast, these are current leaders, up and coming leaders, young people. What do you know now that you wish you'd known then? What would you like to share with them as some hard-won advice?
I have learned to pour from an overflowing cup. It's not about making sure that your cup is half full or that it's not empty. You can't pour from something that's not overflowing. You're supposed to give the excess to people. You're not supposed to give what's in your cup because that belongs to you. They're supposed to get what is coming out and spilling over. And so I've learned that I need to make sure that I'm filling myself completely up so that I have access to give to others. It's not about giving from what you have, it's about giving from your surplus, right? I
Wow.
ask for help all the time. It's not, and it's a skill, right? I had to learn that asking for help puts you in a space of being vulnerable, and vulnerability makes people really uncomfortable. But as a leader, it also shows your people that it's okay. And it makes them feel more comfortable asking for help and admitting that they don't know. I don't know a whole lot of things. And apparently, when you get to be a leader, you can say that and it's okay. But before that, everybody thinks you're just supposed to know everything. You're not. So
Yeah.
there, we've cracked the code. It's okay. Right? It's okay to ask for help.
Oh, I love that. And Anne Lamott has this quote. She has many quotes, but one of them that I really loved is "Don't judge your insides by other people's outsides."
Ooh,
And
that's a good
right,
one.
right. And it struck me as I was listening to you. You were sharing exactly that. That as a leader and in the role that you're at, people are looking to you and they're not recognizing you're doing things despite the fear. That courage is not because you have no fear. It's
Right.
that it is needs to be done. And so I think it's so helpful. That vulnerability is absolutely essential. And again, role models for
Yes.
others, which is very important these days. Last question, and actually we've been sharing back and forth a number of different quotes, but I do like to always end by hearing if you have right now at least a favorite quote or a favorite motto.
I have had this very same quote for a long time, and I am going to read it because she deserves that. Toni Morrison, she said, when I tell my students, when you get these jobs that you have been so brilliantly trained for, just remember that your real job is that if you are free, you need to free someone else. If you have some power, then your job is to empower somebody else. And so just reflecting on my journey of always wanting to be in a space where I'm helping or creating space or moving someone into a different role or amplifying a voice or creating opportunity, my focus has always been on how do I give what little power. And in most of my career, I'm like, it was imaginary, but I was like, I'm here, so I'm just gonna give what I got and hope that it works. But I think now it's like, how are you creating opportunities for other people to thrive? Because when you get into leadership, hopefully some people figure it out sooner rather than later, that it stops being about you and it starts being about what can you do for other people, right? And so I am, a woman of faith. And so I pray for wisdom daily, ask for direction, and then I shut up and I wait, right? And it's like, okay, what am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to show up for other people and the people in my sphere of influence, right? And so I try to live out that Toni Morrison quote on a daily basis.
Well, I think you're doing a great job. Thank you so much for sharing your perspective, your insights, your clarity of focus on your mission, which is such an important reminder these days when focus is never been more challenging, let's put it that way. And your courage for always being an authentic leader. It's so inspiring to hear how creative we can be when we take off those blinders of, well, that's how we've always done it. And when we take those blinders off, I find myself really excited for the future and the difference that Girl Scouts River Valleys is going to make. I also want to thank all of our listeners who are joining this Menttium Matters podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please feel free to share it with friends and colleagues. And if you're interested in additional resources, you can find our show notes on the Menttium website. We look forward to having you join us for our next inspiring conversation.